Charles Manson. In the summer of 1969, a string of killings shook Los Angeles in a way the city had never experienced before. The victims were wealthy, the crime scenes were horrifying, and investigators were staring at a puzzle that, for months, they could not solve. Because the man responsible had not touched a single one of them. Charles Mills Manson was born on November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, the son of a 16-year-old girl who was in and out of his life from the start. He spent much of his childhood cycling through reform schools and juvenile facilities. By the time he was released from Terminal Island Federal Penitentiary in 1967 at age 32, he had spent more than half of his life incarcerated. What he built after walking out of prison was something law enforcement had rarely encountered. Not a criminal organization in the traditional sense, but a commune of devoted followers who believed he was a prophet and who would do whatever he asked. Manson and his group, which the press would come to call the Family, settled at Spahn Ranch, a former movie set in the hills northwest of Los Angeles. He preached an ideology he called Helter Skelter, a vision of an impending race war that he believed the Family would spark and ultimately survive. To accelerate it, he directed his followers toward violence. On the night of August 8, 1969, 4 members of the Family entered the home of actress Sharon Tate and film director Roman Polanski at 1050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles. Tate, who was 8 months pregnant, was at home with 4 guests. All 5 were fatally harmed that night. The following evening, Manson drove his followers to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. He directed others to go inside while he waited. Both were taken from the world before morning. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, who tried the case for Los Angeles County, would later describe the scene at the Tate residence as one that Roman Polanski could not himself have conceived, a scene of human terror and massacre that took place at his own home. Bugliosi stressed a point that became central to the prosecution. Manson had not physically committed the acts, but he had sent his followers to commit them, and under California law, that was enough. The investigation moved slowly. Months passed before a jailhouse informant connected a conversation she had heard to the crimes. Arrests followed in late 1969, and the trial began in June of 1970. It ran for nearly 9 months, one of the longest and most expensive proceedings in California history at that point. On January 25, 1971, Charles Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy in connection with 9 deaths. He was sentenced to death on April 19, 1971, and arrived at San Quentin's death row 4 days later. Then, in February of 1972, the California Supreme Court struck down the state's death penalty statute in People v. Anderson, commuting his sentence and the sentences of all condemned inmates in the state to life imprisonment. Manson would never face execution. His time in California's prison system spanned institutions across the state, including San Quentin, Folsom, the California Medical Facility at Vacaville, and, for the final chapter of his incarceration, Corcoran State Prison, where he was housed in the Protective Housing Unit from 1989 onward. A CDCR spokeswoman confirmed that over the course of his imprisonment, Manson accumulated more than 100 rule violations. He was, by any institutional measure, a chronic management problem. One incident stands out. On September 25, 1984, at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, a fellow inmate named John Holmstrom doused Manson with paint thinner and set him on fire. Reportedly because Manson had objected to Holmstrom's Hare Krishna chanting. Manson survived, sustaining second- and third-degree burns over more than 20% of his body. He remained incarcerated for the rest of his life. On November 19, 2017, Charles Manson died of natural causes at a hospital in Kern County, California. He was 83 years old. This point is worth stating clearly. Manson did not die at San Quentin, and he was never executed. His death sentence, commuted 45 years earlier, ensured that California never carried out what its courts had once imposed. His early placement on San Quentin's death row is part of that prison's history. It would not be the last time the world watched that institution process someone whose crimes had defined an era. Richard Ramirez. For 14 months, something was wrong in Southern California, and no one could say with certainty what it was. Some cases are defined by geography. Richard Ramirez was defined by the darkness he operated in, a figure who moved through Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area for more than a year and a half, leaving a trail of deaths, assaults, and burglaries that no single investigative unit could initially connect. The pattern was too wide and too varied to fit any established profile. Richard Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He grew up in a household marked by violence, and as a teenager came under the influence of a cousin who was a decorated Vietnam veteran and who shared with him graphic accounts of killing. By the time Ramirez arrived in California in his early 20s, he had already developed a preoccupation with violence that no ordinary background check would have caught. From April of 1984 through August of 1985, Ramirez is believed to have taken the lives of at least 13 people across greater Los Angeles and the Bay Area, with some investigators citing higher totals. His victims varied in age, gender, and neighborhood. His methods varied as well. What investigators eventually recognized as his signature was not a specific technique, but a specific quality of escalation. He broke into homes at night, often left satanic symbols at the scene, and showed no pattern in victim selection that would have made prediction possible. The case broke in August of 1985. Investigators had recovered a partial shoe print at one of the crime scenes, an unusual size, and traced it to a specific model of athletic shoe that had been purchased locally. When the manufacturer's distribution records were cross-referenced with shoe retailers, investigators identified the buyer. A composite sketch was released to the public. On August 31, 1985, residents of a neighborhood in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez attempting to steal a car and pursued him on foot through the streets. A crowd subdued him before police arrived. The Night Stalker had been caught not by a task force, but by people on their street who had seen the sketch in the newspaper that morning. Prosecutor Philip Halpin opened the criminal case by stating plainly that the people were alleging first-degree murder in each count, that the killings were premeditated, and that the state was seeking the death penalty. The trial that followed lasted nearly 4 years from arrest to verdict. On September 20, 1989, a jury convicted Ramirez on 13 counts of murder, along with 5 attempted murders, a series of violent assaults, and 14 burglaries. At sentencing on November 7, 1989, Superior Court Judge Michael Tynan imposed death on 19 special circumstance findings. He stated on the record that Ramirez's crimes displayed cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. Ramirez left the courtroom telling reporters that death always comes with the territory and that he would see them in Disneyland. He had earlier told the court that he was beyond good and evil, that he would be avenged, and he flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm. And no, I'm not making that up. He arrived at San Quentin's death row, where he would spend the next 23 years. In that time, he became an object of what criminologists sometimes describe as celebrity criminal fascination. He received large volumes of fan mail in prison gave rare interviews, and cultivated a public persona that leaned into his notoriety rather than away from it. On October 3, 1996, he married an admirer named Doreen Leoy in a ceremony held inside San Quentin. His prison visits were later curtailed in 2004 and again in 2007 following conduct violations. The marriage eventually ended. His appeals continued through the California courts without success. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California, from complications of B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old and had never faced the execution chamber. CDCR noted he was one of 59 condemned California inmates to die of natural causes while awaiting execution since the state reinstated capital punishment in 1978. Richard Ramirez served 23 years on death row without ever coming close to execution. His case moved through the California courts at the pace that the state's death penalty backlog demanded, which is to say very slowly. The death without execution pattern was already forming. The next case would show that same system tested in an entirely different way, not by a prolonged wait, but by a prolonged fight that Ng himself engineered at every stage. Charles Ng Katsisum. Some cases end with a verdict. The case of Charles Ng ended with 13 years of procedural warfare that became one of the most expensive criminal proceedings in California history, an endurance test for a justice system that had never encountered anything quite like the man at the center of it. Charles Chitat Ng was born on December 24, 1960, in Hong Kong, and eventually came to the United States, where he met Leonard Lake, a man who shared a specific and disturbing set of interests. Together, they established a remote property in Wilseyville, in Calaveras County, California. What happened at that property between 1984 and 1985 was discovered not through investigation, but through accident. In June of 1985, Lake was detained in connection with a hardware store theft. Investigators went to the Wilseyville property. What they found there, evidence of killings, videotapes, and human remains, was staggering in scope. The investigation uncovered body parts, partial remains, and documentation of what had occurred on the property over more than a year. Charges that investigators eventually estimated could involve as many as 25 victims emerged from the scene, though the number ultimately proven at trial would be 11. Lake swallowed a cyanide capsule shortly after his arrest and died 4 days later, never facing trial for the acts his own property documented. Ng fled to Canada. He was arrested in Calgary on July 6, 1985, after wounding a security guard during a shoplifting incident at a sporting goods store. The shoplifting charge led to a separate criminal proceeding in Canada before the extradition battle even began. Ng argued that returning to California would expose him to the death penalty, which he contended violated Canadian law and international treaty obligations. He fought extradition for 6 full years. The Supreme Court of Canada ruled against him 4-3 on September 26, 1991, clearing the way for his return to California. What followed inside California's courtrooms was something the system was not prepared for. Ng repeatedly attempted to delay and disrupt his trial. He fired his attorneys. He refused to cooperate with proceedings. The California Supreme Court, in a July 2022 ruling, noted directly that Ng had repeatedly attempted to delay and disrupt his own trial. From his 1985 arrest to his 1999 conviction, 13+ years elapsed. Prosecutors placed the cost of the proceedings in the range of $10 to $20 million, making it one of the most expensive trials in California history at the time. The conviction came on February 24, 1999. A jury found Ng guilty on 11 counts of first-degree murder, including 6 men, 3 women, and 2 infant boys. Evidence presented at trial included recordings that Ung and Lake had made themselves at the property. These tapes documented what had happened to the victims in their own words and on their own faces. On one recording, Ung speaks to a victim named Brenda O'Connor as he cuts off her shirt, telling her she can cry if she wants to, like the rest of them, but that it will not do any good, because they are cold-hearted. Former co-workers testified to statements Ung had made before the crimes, remarks in which he cataloged violence as something to be anticipated and enjoyed. Among the 11 people he was convicted of taking from the world were 2 infant boys, a detail that drew particular attention during sentencing and that Judge Ryan addressed directly when denying the motion to reduce the death sentence. At sentencing, Judge John Ryan rejected a defense motion to reduce the sentence, stating explicitly that Ung had not been under any duress and that the evidence did not support the claim that he had been dominated by Leonard Lake. Death was imposed, and somehow it gets worse. Ung's subsequent appeals ran for years through the California courts. Every challenge was eventually denied. As of May 2025, Ung had been transferred from San Quentin following the closure of California's death row to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He remains there condemned more than 4 decades after the acts themselves. Governor Gavin Newsom's March 2019 executive order placed a moratorium on all executions in California, and the state has since dismantled its execution apparatus. The sentence stands. The machinery to carry it out no longer exists. Up to this point in this story, each man had arrived at San Quentin through crimes that spanned months or years. What made the next case different was something simpler, and in its way, more disturbing. A man who told the world exactly what he was, and then did it anyway. William Bonin. He did not hide what he was. That was what made William Bonin different from most of the men who passed through the courts of Southern California. Before his trial, he told a reporter that he would still be taking lives if he had not been caught, that he could not stop, that it had gotten easier each time. William George Bonin was born on January 8, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut. His father was a violent alcoholic, and the household Bonin grew up in was by any measure severely disordered. He was placed in an orphanage as a child, and from his earliest years, the record documents a pattern of harm against others that escalated in both frequency and severity as he aged. He served in the United States Air Force from 1965 to 1968, including a tour in Vietnam. He returned to California in 1968, and his criminal history began almost immediately. He was incarcerated twice before his killing spree began, once in 1969 and again in 1975, both times for serious violent offenses. Both times, he was released. In October of 1978, at age 31, he was freed and moved back in with his mother in Downey, California. The worst began within months. From May of 1979 through June of 1980, Bonin targeted teenage boys and young men across Southern California's freeway corridors. He drove a customized van with modified rear doors. He used a method of strangulation that prosecutor Sterling Norris would later describe in court as a signature, a trademark, a technique so specific it linked each body to a single perpetrator. Norris told jurors that Bonin had enjoyed the killings, that he had planned to enjoy them again, and that he possessed what Norris described as an insatiable appetite for violence and for taking life. The language was precise and deliberate. By the time investigators had connected the cases, Bonin had taken the lives of 14 young men across Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties, while later confessing to 21. His four accomplices, all in their late teens or early 20s, were tried separately and received varying sentences. By late 1979, investigators had begun to recognize a pattern in the bodies accumulating along Southern California's freeways, matching ligature marks, consistent victim profiles, and signs of extended captivity before death. A multi-agency task force formed and developed a profile of a white male in his 30s driving a van. Survivor David McVicker, who had been attacked by Bonin in 1975 and released, recognized the pattern from news coverage and contacted police. The surveillance that followed led investigators directly to Bonin. On June 11, 1980, officers following that surveillance operation caught Bonin inside his van in Hollywood. He was arrested on the spot. His vehicle yielded restraints, weapons, bloodstains, and trace evidence matching multiple victims. He initially denied involvement, then confessed to 21 killings and implicated his accomplices. One of them, Vernon Butts, was arrested and also confessed, then took his own life in jail before trial. He was tried in Los Angeles County and again in Orange County, receiving death sentences in both jurisdictions. First in 1982 for 10 Los Angeles County murders, then additionally for 4 Orange County murders. His appeals ran for over a decade. None succeeded. Governor Pete Wilson, who denied clemency, called Bonin the poster boy for capital punishment. On February 23, 1996, William Bonin became the first person executed by lethal injection in California. The execution took place at San Quentin. Warden Arthur Calderon gave the order at 12:09 in the morning, and Bonin was pronounced dead at 12:13. His last meal was 2 large pepperoni and sausage pizzas, 3 pints of coffee ice cream, and 3 six-packs of Coca-Cola. His final statement, delivered to the warden, was that he believed the death penalty was not an answer to the problems at hand, and that it sent the wrong message to the country's youth. The irony of that statement, from a man who had confessed to 21 killings, who had told a reporter before trial that he would still be taking lives if he had not been caught, and who had never expressed remorse in any other recorded moment, was not lost on anyone in that room. William Bonin was 49 years old at the time of his execution. The same morning Bonin was pronounced dead, a man named Clarence Ray Allen was already serving a life sentence inside a California state prison. He had been convicted of ordering one fatal harm from behind bars, and the record would show he had already arranged others. Clarence Ray Allen. There is a particular kind of criminal that the justice system is designed to contain. The person who, having been caught and imprisoned, uses the institutional environment to organize further harm from inside. Clarence Ray Allen was that person in the most direct, documented way imaginable. Allen was born on January 16, 1930, in Fresno, California. By the mid-1970s, he was running a burglary operation in the Central Valley. In 1974, a young woman named Mary Sue Kitts, the girlfriend of Allen's son and a member of his network, informed on his operation to law enforcement. Allen arranged for her to be fatally harmed. He was convicted of that crime in 1977 and received a life sentence. He entered California's prison system on March 16, 1978. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. From inside prison, Allen made contact with associates on the outside and arranged for the elimination of witnesses who could testify against him or members of his network. On September 5, 1980, a man named Billy Ray Hamilton, recently paroled, entered Franz Market in Fresno and fatally harmed 3 people. Brian Schletowitz, whose family had cooperated with law enforcement in the original case against Allen, Josephine Rocha, a teenage employee at the market, and Douglas White, another worker. The motive was witness elimination. The order had come from inside a California state prison. Investigators traced the chain from Hamilton back to Allen. Hamilton was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Allen was separately charged with ordering the killings. He arrived at San Quentin's death row on December 2, 1982. What followed was decades of legal proceedings. Allen's attorneys raised every available challenge, including constitutional arguments regarding the execution of a man who had grown elderly and severely ill during the time his appeals consumed. By the time his execution date was set, Allen was 75 years old. He was legally blind, nearly deaf, diabetic, and using a wheelchair after a major cardiac event in September of 2005. Federal courts considered and rejected arguments that executing a man of Allen's age and physical condition constituted cruel and unusual punishment. The Supreme Court declined to intervene. Deputy Attorney General Ward Campbell described the case as a direct attack on the criminal justice system, perpetrated by a man whom society had believed was safely contained. His argument to the court was that Allen had not simply committed crimes. He had weaponized his incarceration against the people responsible for putting him there. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger denied clemency, stating that Allen's conduct had not resulted from youth or inexperience, and that the victims' families had waited long enough. On January 17, 2006, the day after his 76th birthday, Clarence Ray Allen became the oldest person ever executed in California. The execution required a second dose of potassium chloride. He was pronounced dead at 12:38 in the morning. His final words were read aloud by Warden Stephen Ornosky, because Allen's physical condition prevented him from speaking them clearly. He said it was a good day to die, followed by expressions of love for those present and a simple goodbye. The Schladewitz family released a statement that morning. They said it had taken 30 years from the burglary of Franz Market to that night for Clarence Allen to receive his just punishment. It was a sentence that captured something the legal record alone could not. The length of time that families of murder victims can spend waiting for a justice system to reach its conclusion. In Allen's case, that wait had stretched across 3 decades, through his initial conviction, his arrival on death row, his years of appeals, and 2 full terms of gubernatorial review. The sentence had been imposed in 1982. It was carried out in 2006. 24 years had passed between those 2 moments. Allen remains the most recent person executed in California. Since that morning in January of 2006, no other condemned inmate in the state has been put to death. The moratorium that Governor Gavin Newsom formalized in March of 2019 was, in practice, already underway long before he signed it. California had not executed anyone in 13 years by the time that order was issued. In 2024, the state completed the physical closure of San Quentin's death row, transferring its condemned population to prisons across the state and dismantling the execution chamber itself. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Robert Alton Harris. On the morning of April the 21st, 1992, 4 separate court orders had been issued to stop the same execution. One of them arrived while the condemned man was already strapped into the gas chamber at San Quentin. The United States Supreme Court had to issue an emergency ruling in the early hours of that morning, ordering federal courts to issue no further stays. What followed was the first execution in California in 25 years. If you'd asked anyone close to the case in the summer of 1978, they would have told you Robert Alton Harris was headed somewhere terrible. They had no idea it would end this way. Harris was born on January 15, 1953, into a family defined by violence and alcohol. He was one of 9 children. His early years produced a criminal record that grew in seriousness through his teens. Assault, weapons charges, and eventually manslaughter in connection with the death of a man beaten during a dispute in 1975. He served time for that and was released. By July of 1978, he was 25 years old and planning a bank robbery with his younger brother Daniel in San Diego County. On July 5, 1978, the Harris brothers encountered 16-year-old best friends John Majewski and Michael Baker in a supermarket parking lot in the Mira Mesa neighborhood. The two teenagers had just bought hamburgers. Harris forced them to drive to Miramar Lake, then fatally harmed both of them in order to use their car as the getaway vehicle for the bank robbery. Witnesses and the record indicate that Harris finished the boys' hamburgers after the fact and laughed about what he had done. What happened that day had a dimension that would not become publicly known for some time. One of the arresting officers who later responded to the case was a San Diego detective named Steve Baker. Michael Baker, one of the two teenagers who lost their lives at Miramar Lake, was his son. Detective Baker did not realize the connection until after the arrest. Harris was convicted of first-degree murder on March 6, 1979. He arrived at San Quentin's death row and remained there for more than 13 years as his appeals wound through the courts. The case drew enormous national attention, both because of its factual brutality and because it became a flashpoint in the broader debate over capital punishment. So how does a man facing execution generate 4 separate last-minute legal interventions in the space of one morning? The answer is the sheer volume of constitutional challenges his legal team raised in the final hours, arguments about the cruelty of the gas chamber that had been working their way through the federal courts. Ninth Circuit Judge Harry Pregerson issued one of the stays while Harris was physically strapped into the execution chair. The Supreme Court of the United States, in an extraordinary and rare direct intervention, vacated every stay and issued the order that no further federal court could issue additional ones except with the Supreme Court's own permission. Harris was executed in the gas chamber at San Quentin at 6:21 in the morning on April 21, 1992. The 4 stays of execution issued that morning had each been overturned within hours, some within minutes. A federal judge had earlier ordered the execution filmed as evidence in ongoing litigation over whether the gas chamber constituted cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. The United States Supreme Court later ordered those tapes destroyed. Witnesses in the observation area, including members of the Baker family, reported that as Harris lost consciousness, he caught the eye of Michael Baker's father and silently mouthed that he was sorry. His final statement, relayed by Warden Daniel Vasquez, was that everyone dances with the Grim Reaper, whether a king or a street sweeper. His execution ended a 25-year period during which no one had been put to death in California. It would be followed by 2 more in the 1990s, and then one final execution in 2006. After that, the state went silent. The case that came next in California's courts had a different kind of public weight entirely. It produced a law, a movement, and a father whose name became synonymous with a child no one could save. Richard Allen Davis. On the night of October 1, 1993, a man with a long criminal history and an active parole status walked into a home in Petaluma, California, tied up 2 children who were present, and carried away their 12-year-old friend at knife point. That single act would eventually reshape California's criminal sentencing laws for a generation. Davis was born on June 2, 1954, in Los Angeles, and had accumulated a record of serious violent offenses across more than 2 decades before that night. He had served multiple prison terms, including a 14-year sentence for kidnapping. He was on parole, having been released from state prison earlier that same year of 1993. His release, and the absence of any mechanism that would have flagged him as a specific ongoing risk, became part of the political conversation that followed the crime. Polly Klaas was 12 years old, a student with a love of theater and a large circle of friends. She had been hosting a slumber party at her mother's home on Wickersham Way in Petaluma when Davis appeared. He bound her two friends, who were unable to free themselves for some time, and took Polly into the night. The disappearance triggered one of the largest volunteer searches in California history. Mark Klaas, Polly's father, became the central public face of that effort, appearing repeatedly on national television programs, working alongside law enforcement and thousands of volunteers. Flyers bearing Polly's photograph circulated across the state and beyond. The case drew sustained national media attention for more than 2 months. The search was remarkable both in its scale and in the degree to which ordinary people across California gave time and resources to find a girl most of them had never met. Polly's remains were discovered near Cloverdale in December of 1993. Davis, who had been detained in connection with an unrelated matter in Sonoma County on October 1st, the same night as the abduction, had been briefly questioned and released. He was not connected to the disappearance at that time. 2 months later, after more thorough analysis of evidence from that detention, investigators linked him to the case. Under questioning, Davis led them to Polly's location. He was charged with first-degree murder with special circumstances. The trial began in 1995 in Santa Clara County. On June 18, 1996, a jury convicted Davis of first-degree murder with special circumstances including kidnapping, burglary, and an attempted criminal act against a child. The death verdict came on August 5, 1996. But the verdict was not the moment the courtroom remembered most from that day. Davis stood after the verdict was read and thrust both middle fingers toward the courtroom camera. At his formal sentencing, he delivered a statement to the court in which he made an unsupported claim about Polly's last words, an allegation her father and all available evidence contradicted, and which was widely characterized as a deliberate final act of cruelty against the Klaas family. Mark Klaas lunged at Davis in the courtroom, had to be physically restrained by bailiffs, and was heard shouting at Davis to burn in hell. Judge Thomas Hastings then imposed the death sentence. He stated directly that Davis had made the decision about sentencing very easy by his conduct that day. Klaas said afterward that he had done what he came to do, and that Davis was now his worst nightmare. Davis survived a 2006 opiate overdose in his cell. His appeals continued for years. In 2024, a judge named Benjamin Williams rejected a motion to vacate his death sentence. As of January 2026, Richard Allen Davis remains condemned, transferred out of San Quentin's adjustment center following the closure of California's death row. His case is not closed. Polly's abduction, carried out by a man on active parole for prior kidnapping, drove the passage of California's 3 strikes law, signed by Governor Pete Wilson on March 8, 1994. The law was one of the most significant changes to sentencing in the state's history. It was written, in large part, in Polly Klaas's name. The man who came after Davis on this list had a different kind of public recognition around him. Not from his crimes at first, but from a brother whose story had given the country a rare and remarkable story of survival. Cary Stayner. The name Stayner was already known to much of America before the summer of 1999. Not because of Cary, but because of his younger brother Stephen, who had been abducted at age 7 in 1972 and held for 7 years before escaping and returning home. Stephen Stainer's story was the subject of a 1989 television film. He died in a motorcycle accident in 1989, shortly after the film aired. Carey, the older brother, lived quietly in the background of that story for years, working as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel near Yosemite. What was happening inside him during those years would not become public until he chose to confess. Carey Stainer was born on August 13, 1961, in Merced, California. By the time investigators began looking at him in 1999, he was 37 years old, employed at the Cedar Lodge in El Portal, a small community just outside the entrance to Yosemite National Park. In February of 1999, 3 women who had been staying at the Cedar Lodge went missing. Carol Sund, 42, and her 15-year-old daughter Julie, along with Argentine exchange student Silvina Peloso, 16, were last seen at the motel on the night of February 15th. Their rental car was found burned near Highway 120 in Tuolumne County. A multi-agency investigation involving the FBI and California law enforcement was launched, and for weeks, investigators pursued other leads and suspects before Stainer drew attention to himself. The remains of Carol Sund and Silvina Peloso were eventually located at a reservoir in Lake County. Julie Sund's body was found separately in a remote area in Tuolumne County. Its location revealed in part by an anonymous note Stainer sent to investigators. The note included a hand-drawn map and a message that read, "We had fun with this one." That's not a typo, by the way. He wrote to investigators and directed them to the body himself, apparently for the stimulation of watching law enforcement respond. On July 21, 1999, Stainer encountered Joey Armstrong, 26, a naturalist employed by the Yosemite Institute. Armstrong managed to escape briefly during the attack and was found the following morning near her cabin. The trace evidence from her case led investigators to Stainer's 1972 International Scout. He was arrested on July 24, 1999, and confessed all 4 killings to FBI Special Agent Jeffrey Rinnick in an extended interview. Rinnick later described the confession in detail in a published account. Stainer had initially attempted to negotiate for access to a collection of child material before agreeing to speak. Rinnick described Stainer as having chosen that request over financial reward for his family or the opportunity to be housed near them. Stainer pleaded guilty to Armstrong's murder in federal court in 2001, receiving a life sentence for that crime. That plea resolved his federal exposure. He was then tried separately in state court for the murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Peloso. His trial took place in Stanislaus County after a change of venue was granted. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence, including his recorded confession to FBI agent Rinnick and physical evidence from each location. The defense raised an insanity claim, arguing that Stainer had experienced decades of disturbing ideation that met the legal threshold for diminished responsibility. The jury rejected it. The deliberations lasted 3 days. In December of 2002, Stainer was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Judge Thomas Hastings, the same judge who had sentenced Richard Allen Davis 6 years earlier, presided. Stainer has since been investigated in connection with other unsolved cases in the Yosemite region, but has never been charged with additional crimes. As of the time of this writing, Stainer is confined at Pelican Bay State Prison following the 2024 closure of San Quentin's death row. His sentence remains in place. The moratorium on executions means no date has been set. For 14 months of killing, the victims were women encountered largely by circumstance at a specific location. The next man on this list chose his victims differently, by terrain, and he had been doing it for years before anyone put his name to the pattern. David Carpenter. He was known on the trails before anyone knew his name. Hikers on Mount Tamalpayas, at Point Reyes National Seashore, and in the Santa Cruz Mountains began encountering a pattern of violence starting in the late 1970s. A lone attacker who targeted hikers in remote sections of Bay Area trails, leaving no witnesses. The press named him the Trailside Killer before investigators had a suspect. By the time they found him, he had been living quietly in plain sight, working as a typesetter, a man who stuttered so severely in ordinary conversation that he was considered unremarkable by most people who met him. David Joseph Carpenter was born on May 6, 1930, in San Francisco. His early history included institutionalization as a teenager for acts of harm against family members. As a young adult, he was convicted of serious violent offenses involving women, including kidnapping, and served lengthy prison sentences. He was released and reoffended. The pattern repeated. He was convicted again, served more time, was released again. He committed every murder on his convicted record, while under some form of parole or post-release supervision. Each time the system processed him and returned him to the world, he returned to the trails. What pathologists and investigators would later note was unusual about Carpenter's profile was the relationship between his stutter and his attacks. According to forensic assessments, the stutter that marked him as harmless in daily life disappeared entirely during his crimes. The terror of the moment appeared to resolve it. The killings attributed to Carpenter spanned the period from 1979 to 1981 across multiple Bay Area counties. His victims were typically hikers encountered alone or in pairs on isolated trails. 7 murders were ultimately proven across 2 separate trials. If there was a detail the investigation almost missed, it was the geographic range. Because the killings spanned Marin County, the Santa Cruz Mountains, and Point Reyes, the cases fell under different jurisdictions and were not immediately connected. It was the pattern of the crimes, the locations, the approach, and the forensic signatures that eventually drew the cases together under a single profile. The legal proceedings against Carpenter were split across jurisdictions and venues. His first trial was held in Los Angeles County, chosen as a neutral venue given the publicity surrounding the Bay Area cases. The jury convicted him in 1984 of the Marin County and Santa Cruz murders, including those of Ellen Hansen and Heather Skaggs, and sentenced him to death in November of that year. A second trial, held in San Diego County for additional killings, followed and resulted in a second death sentence in 1988. The 2 separate proceedings spanned years and cost the state tens of millions of dollars. Carpenter maintained his innocence throughout both trials and in the years since, telling investigators at one point that he had been the logical suspect, that everyone had been convinced of his guilt long before any charges were filed, and that the case against him had been built on circumstance. For years, he was the oldest man on California's death row. DNA evidence developed after his convictions connected him to additional cases, though no new charges followed. Santa Cruz County prosecutors who worked his case stated publicly that he deserved to face the sentence imposed. As of 2025, David Carpenter is alive at age 94, transferred from San Quentin to the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton in May of 2025, where he uses a wheelchair. A widely circulated claim, spread across several true crime websites in 2024, reported that Carpenter had died. That claim was false. He had been moved to Stockton for medical care related to his age and condition. He remains on the condemned list. The sentence is formally in place. The state's moratorium on executions, combined with the dismantling of the execution chamber at San Quentin, means that sentence will not be carried out under current policy. Carpenter is, at the time of writing, one of the oldest living individuals under a sentence of death in the United States. The last man on this list arrived on San Quentin's death row in 1980, spent more than 4 decades there, and in some respects became the most peculiar public figure of all the condemned men the prison ever housed, not because of who he was, but because of when he was and what he was doing while his crimes were ongoing. Rodney Alcala. In the summer of 1978, Rodney Alcala appeared on the American Broadcasting Company's television program, The Dating Game. He won the episode as Bachelor Number 1. The Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, had the choice of whether to accept the date. She declined, telling producers she found him creepy and that something about the encounter made her uncomfortable. At the time of his appearance on the program, investigators believe Alcala had already taken at least 2 lives and was in the middle of a killing spree that would continue for another year. Alcala was born on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas. He studied film at UCLA in the 1960s under Roman Polanski, the same director whose home would later become the Tate crime scene. He had a prior conviction for harming a young child, which he served time for and from which he was paroled before the television appearance. Between 1977 and 1979, he is confirmed to have taken the lives of 5 women and girls in California: Jill Barcombe, 18, Georgia Wixted, 27, Charlotte Lamb, 32, Jill Parenteau, 21, and Robin Samso, 12. He later pleaded guilty to 2 additional murders in New York. Based on more than 1,000 photographs discovered in a Seattle storage locker after his arrest, investigators believe the actual total of victims could be substantially higher, with estimates reaching as many as 130, though confirmed victim counts remain much lower. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains much of what made Alcala so difficult to prosecute. His pattern, described in court by prosecutors and corroborated by forensic and witness evidence, involved a deliberate cycle of bringing victims near to death and reviving them repeatedly before completing the act. It was a form of control that left a specific forensic signature and that multiple witnesses and investigators described as methodical. Jill Barcombe's brother Bruce told the court during proceedings that there is a category of violent crime, and then there is something beyond that, something that only a name like Rodney Alcala could define. He was first convicted in 1980 and arrived on San Quentin's death row that same year. His conviction was overturned twice on procedural grounds before a 3rd trial was held in 2010. At that trial, Alcala chose to represent himself and conducted a cross-examination of himself on the stand, adopting a lower voice to ask questions as the defendant and answering them as the witness, at one point asking himself about his hair. Judge Francisco Briceño had warned the jury in advance that the arrangement might be what he described as a tad awkward. It was not the word most observers used. He was convicted again in 2010 and sentenced to death for the 5th time in the case's history. His appeals were denied. He died of natural causes, a heart attack, on July 24, 2021, at a hospital in Kings County, California. He was 77 years old and had been on San Quentin's death row for more than 4 decades. Tali Shapiro, who had survived an earlier attack by Alcala in 1968 when she was a child, and whose testimony across the years had contributed to his prosecution, said after his death that the planet was a better place without him. A Wyoming investigator named Jeff Sheeman, who had been working Alcala's potential connections to cases in that state, said he was where he needed to be. As of 2026, the investigations into Alcala's potential additional victims remain open in multiple states, including Wyoming and New York. The photographs from the Seattle storage locker, released publicly by law enforcement, in the hope that families might identify missing loved ones, have resulted in a small number of identifications over the years. The full extent of his crimes has never been determined, and it likely never will be. San Quentin has housed men who were executed there, men who died there of natural causes, and men who were eventually transferred out when the death row itself was closed in 2024. The 10 men on this list represent a span of more than 60 years in that prison's history. What connects them is not the institution, but the fact that California's criminal justice system, at various points in time, determined that each of them was the worst that humanity could produce. Whether the sentence that followed that determination was carried out, or simply waited in perpetuity, is a question each case answered differently. San Quentin is being rebuilt as a rehabilitation facility. The execution chamber is gone. The condemned men who lived in the cells of East Block for decades are scattered across the state in other institutions. But the cases are still in the record, and the sentences are still formally in place. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.